Okay, so with the recent TennoCon 1999 big reveal, we got our first look at Proto Nyx, and I know for a fact I'm not the only one that kind of thinks they want to main Nyx now just because of this. But Nyx is obviously a frame who is kind of at the bottom of the pack, let's be real. Her kit does some pretty useful things, but unfortunately everything she does is kind of outclassed by other frames. And at TennoCon they also did announce that both Trinity and Nyx will be getting what they said to be a light rework, but they also said Inaris's rework was light, and it kind of felt like a full-on rework, so I'm hoping we get some similar treatment for both Nyx and Trinity. And because of the announcement of the rework and the fact that we get to play this like awesome neuron activation version of Nyx, I figured I'd revisit the Warframe and try to make some builds that not only are effective but also make her fun. That's my biggest problem with Nyx, is that I've never found her kit to be particularly enjoyable. One of my biggest gripes is that the most effective playstyle on her seems to be Assimilate. Assimilate being the augment for her fourth ability, which allows her to move around in her invulnerable state, but unfortunately you are at 50% movement speed, and I hate being slow in Warframe. So in today's video I'm going to cover two different builds, both with very different playstyles. The first one being focused around Assimilate, being extremely tanky and having solid damage output and CC, but also kind of negating some of the speed loss that we get from the augment. And then I have a very special setup which doesn't use Assimilate or her fourth ability at all and subsumes it off for something quite unique. A shield gate and damage focused setup using an ability that most of you won't have ever guessed using on this Warframe. Before we get into all of the builds, let's take a quick look at Nyx's base kit. First off, starting with Nyx's quite unique passive, enemies are 20% less accurate when targeting her. This simply means that enemies basically have worse aim, meaning you'll take overall a bit less damage. But this isn't nearly as useful as something like Zaku's dodge chance. Unfortunately, her first ability, Mind Control, is rather lackluster. You target an enemy and then shoot them to charge them up with bonus damage, and then that enemy will turn onto your side after the first few seconds of being stunned, and then start blasting the enemy. This has good duration, and I do like the mechanic that you can charge up the damage by shooting the target. But the problem with this skill is that even though they've made improvements to it over the years and made the damage higher, it still isn't enough to do any sort of realistically good damage versus targets, even ones that are armor stripped. It's just sort of very slow to kill, at least versus most targets anyway. Sometimes if you get a heavy unit it will do pretty good damage, versus maybe like a butcher that you stripped armor off. And it also has an augment which can increase the damage further. However, this is still not going to be anywhere near as potent as, let's say, Wukong's clone, or even Equinox's clone that she gets from Duality. However, where this ability does come in handy is that certain enemies you use this on will give you their buffs. For example, if you use this on a shield osprey, you'll get the shields, and if you use this on an ancient healer, you'll get damage reduction, which is my personal favourite way to use it. Overall, this ability has a lot of potential due to the fact that if you combine it with specific enemy types, it becomes very good for keeping you alive. However, its damage department isn't very strong, and I feel like they'd have to buff it significantly for it to even be remotely useful in this part. Her second ability, Psychic Bolts, is basically a particle-based armor strip or defense reduction. You send out bolts, which by default is capped at 6 and increased to 9 bolts total via its augment. However, this is 9 at a time, so if you are using the augment and you throw this onto a group of enemies and strip 9 enemies armor, and then were to turn to the right of you and throw it at the horde on the right, the enemies on the left would lose their armor strip and the enemies on the right would be granted it. This is one of the first problems with this ability. With this augment it does also confuse the enemies temporarily, but my biggest gripe with this ability is that the armor strip, or the debuff rather, has a duration. With the rework, I am hoping they get rid of this feature. I can maybe get by with like them increasing the projectiles and total enemies you could affect at once, because I do think that it should be at least 9 at base and maybe like 14 with the augment. But why the hell does this have a duration on its armor strip? Because a bunch of other Warframes have armor strips that are stronger than this and they aren't limited by duration. This feature needs to go. Having said that, within gameplay itself, and as long as you have a decent duration on your build, enemies aren't going to get their armor back before you kill them. So spamming this on general groups of enemies is pretty damn effective for a strip. Her third ability, Chaos, is pretty much pure crowd control. Enemies within range will be confused and attack whoever's closest to them, including their allies or other factions. However, if you are close enough to them, they'll also attack you, so it's not 100% reliable, but overall good for keeping you and your squad mates alive. And then, in my opinion, the most unfortunate of Nyx's abilities is Absorb. Without its augment, it will holster you in one place and you will absorb all damage, taking absolutely no damage yourself and charging up an explosion that you can release at the end of the ability. This takes a long time to charge up, and the damage does not scale particularly well, even against enemies without armor. Whilst you are invulnerable in the charging phase, you will gain energy whilst this is turned on, and the augment allows you to walk around with this turned on, but at 50% speed, so it basically makes you a very slow tank. And I think the biggest missed opportunity with this skill, let alone that the damage from the explosion is terrible, you receive a damage buff at the end of its duration, and this can get up to 400% if you let enemies shoot you for enough damage. 400% damage buff is no joke, but unfortunately the duration is fucking horrendous. Even if you build for duration, it's really not that worth to sit there and take a bunch of damage and absorb and then disperse the ability just to get a damage buff of 400% for like 20 seconds probably tops, and that's if you've got a lot of duration on the build, which is unfortunate because obviously narrow-minded reduces your range and Nyx also really wants range. So this just isn't worth building for at all, and I'm hoping that a number of things with this ability get reworked, including the duration of the buff. And of course this is arguably one of Nyx's best abilities with the augment because it makes you really hard to kill, and you'll see in the build today we have a way of making this a bit more fun and more fast. However, I personally don't enjoy Assimilate as an ability just because it's very slow and clunky. It doesn't feel good to use at all. So we're going to start with the more basic build that you guys are probably familiar with, and that is of course the Assimilate playstyle. This is focused on being very relaxed and tanky. Nothing much is really going to phase you, and you can just sort of walk around and do whatever the hell you want. Some good damage buffs as well as some ways to make you move faster in the Assimilate. The run that you're seeing in the background was just a little bit of a stress test to see how well the survivability scales on Assimilate, and turns out it does pretty damn well. I wasn't expecting to be this surprised with Nyx's survivability, but she's functionally unkillable. The invulnerability from Assimilate as well as the crowd control from Chaos, the constant armor stripping from your 2, and in this build I am replacing mind control with Nourish. I know, a bit of a boring pick, but here's why. The build is focused around being able to not only keep Assimilate up for as long as I need or want, but also be able to handle itself somewhat decently well with the ability turned off, just so that way I don't do my fucking head in by moving around at 50% speed all the time. This build is versatile in the sense that you can turn off Assimilate and run around and use your other abilities, and Nourish is not only going to give you a nice viral damage buff for your weapons, which is very useful when we armor strip enemies, but it's also giving us a nice energy multiplier, meaning I can spam my abilities and keep Assimilate active more often. Due to the armor strip that Nyx has, I felt like using the Kuva Ogress on this build. The Kuva Ogress is kind of a meh weapon for the most part, outside of the fact that when you combine it with certain abilities and skills in the game, it gets way better. And that's because it's mainly focused on just pure damage. As my secondary, I was using a Furious with its Incarnon, and it proved to be extremely reliable. But another nice little synergy here is that I'm using my Bow Prime Incarnon in this run as well, and this is because this weapon has a massive amount of range, meaning that I can hit enemies from further away, helping with the fact that I am incredibly slow. And of course, before we get into the builds, let's quickly cover the Archon Shards. Now, it is worth noting, the 2 blue Tower Forge for energy max, these are only here for the second build. You do not need these for this first build that you're about to look at, so don't worry about these, unless you really want to try the second one. We'll get into that later. And then for my yellow Tower Forge Amber Shards, we have 2 for parkour velocity, and then 1 for casting speed. The casting speed is going to stack with the casting speed buff from Madurai, and this just makes Nyx more fluid to play, as our casting speed is kind of slow. And then the parkour velocity is so we can roll further and faster when we are in Assimilate. And there's more where that came from in the build. Now before we get into the build, reminder, Nourish is in our first slot. Growing power in the aura is optional. I'm simply using this because I guess it's just more strength for Nourish, thus giving us a better buff. But the armor strip from Psychic Bolts only requires, I believe, 125% strength in order to get it to 100%. So realistically, you don't need either Intensify or Growing Power, and you can just use the strength buff from Madurai. So both Intensify and Growing Power are flex slots. I'd say Augur Reach would be a good pick, because that way you can have a nice little bit of shield gating and more range, or whenever you want to turn off Assimilate. Speaking of course Assimilate and Pacifying Bolts in here for more projectiles on R2. Prime Flow, Equilibrium and Energize for energy sustain, even though we have Nourish. Personally, from my testing, I just feel like if I want to stay in Assimilate, especially at higher levels, I really want all of these energy buffs, just because the cost of her 3, her 2 and her 4 really calls for that energy buff. Stretch for our range, specifically for Chaos, and of course Prime Continuity for our duration, and then the last 2 being Amar's Anguish and Mobilize, and these are for even more parkour velocity, allowing us to roll even further and Assimilate, and of course Amar's Anguish allows us to teleport to enemies via heavy attacks, thus allowing us to cover more ground in our 4th. And for even more rolling speed when we're in Assimilate, we're using Arc and Agility, which does proc even though you are technically invincible. So you don't have to worry about turning off Assimilate to activate this, it will proc and it will allow you to move way further. And just before we get into the Kuva Ogress build, I made this weapon ages ago, way back when these sort of first came out, so that's why my dumbass has radiation at base on here. If you're going to pick an element to put on your Kuva Ogress when you get this, just pick Toxin, it's going to be way better. And even though I'm using Nourish and Armor Stripping, I still opt to use Viral Damage because it just stacks nicely. In addition to that, we're using Nightwatch Napalm. This is a fantastic mod for this weapon, as it allows you to do massive tick damage over time. And yeah, the whole build is just focused around pure damage, and it would be even stronger either if you have a Riven or if you get rid of the stupid ass radiation I have on here, which I guess I could do that eventually. And highly recommend primed sniper ammo mutation so you can keep using the weapon. Here are my Furious evolutions. Of course the first and the third can be interchanged, and we're rocking Corrosive and Blast. It says Corrosive Cold, but remember in Incarnate form you get innate heat, so that combines, thus making Corrosive Blast. And we're also using Viral from Nourish. You can switch this up of course because everything's going to be stripped that you're shooting. But having the triple element setup is absolutely insane on here. And as for the bow prime, I'm not even using this as a stat stick. I just wanted to make this like an actual good Incarnate weapon. Here are the evolutions that I am running. And this thing actually isn't that bad. It can feel a bit slow at times on Nyx for some reason. And if it does feel slow, I'd recommend dropping Spring-Loaded Blade for more attack speed. But yeah, we're going full meta influence and status. You could argue that yeah, you could go some crit on here, but from my testing, the crit isn't even worth building for. Just going full status and proccing a bunch of blasts, especially on enemies that don't have any armor. This will absolutely wipe hordes of enemies. And of course with Prime Reach, Spring-Loaded Blade, the +4 range from its Incarnate, and the evolution that gives plus 0.5 range, this thing can hit from across the room, thus making the speed on your 4 less of a problem. And now we're going to move on to the next build that I'm super excited to show you, which is more focused on a super unique playstyle that you may not have seen on Nyx before, where we forego her 4th ability and its augment and focus on a more caster active playstyle as well as damage spreading. This is the Tesla Nervos Nyx setup. We are inserting Vauban's Tesla ability with its augment. At first glance, you guys are probably thinking, what the hell is this? Isn't that ability fucking useless? On its own, you could say so, yeah, it's not great, but the augment has a very unique ability and mechanic that works particularly well with Warframes that have a good armor strip. Any enemy that is stunned by your Tesla will spread the damage that they take to nearby enemies, and this is extremely potent versus enemies that don't have armor, which of course Nyx can strip a lot of. You can throw down 4 of these Teslas at once, and of course they do stun enemies as well, and they can also proc arc on stretch. So combining a very potent weapon that has good single target damage and good damage spread overall within an area, i.e. in this case I was using the Strun Prime with its Incarnate. Stripping enemies armor with your second ability and throwing a decent amount of Teslas around is going to allow you to nuke hordes of enemies with ease. And because both of these abilities are kind of caster based as well as your third, it allows you to shield gate constantly for your survivability. It is the most active build I've used for Nyx, and in my opinion it is way more fun than running Assimilate and provides a nice little challenge as well. Me personally, I just really enjoy the amount of damage spread you get from this combo of abilities. And we are also using mind control still in this build as well. And I did notice on occasion that if I maybe mind controlled a bombard and charged up their damage, that on some instances, if an enemy that was hit by Tesla was then struck by the bombard that I had mind controlled, the enemies in the area were stripped, it would actually kill the horde of enemies. This is of course very rare and only sort of happened a couple of times, which is kind of the reason why mind control isn't that good, but it's just a super cool interaction to see. And of course mind control is solid on the build because I just recommend mind controlling a shield osprey, or in my case I prefer to do ancient healers. This build has a slightly higher skill ceiling in the sense that you have to do a lot of ability casting to stay alive, but goddamn is it satisfying to use, and I really hope you guys try this one out. And before I forget to mention it, I was using the Nautilus in both of these setups so I can group up enemies with its Cordon ability. Now, Madurai is way more important with this setup because I'm not using any strength within the build because it is quite tightly knit. But due to Madurai's sling strength ability, we can hit the threshold to be able to get past that 100% strip on our strength, making our psychic bolts have 100% armor strip. And of course, we also gain the bonus casting speed. So of course, brief respire in the aura for our shield gate. Prime Sure-Footed is here this time because we don't have knockdowns on the Assimilate build, but in here we're not using Assimilate, so we need this. Equilibrium and Streamline and Energize for energy sustain. You're really going to need these. If you want to slide another former in here, you can also go with Archon Stretch, which is going to allow you to regen energy via those electric procs from Tesla. Pacifying Bolts, of course, for more projectiles on our strip. Tesla Bank, the augment, which allows us to do the massive damage spreading. Prime Continuity for duration. And then finally, for our survivability, we have Rolling Guard, Catalyzing Shields, and Aegis. But if you don't like shield gating, another thing you can do in this build is go for Redirection or Primed Redirection, and then throw Adaptation in here instead of Rolling Guard, giving you more of a damage reduction setup, sort of being a bit more of a face tank. This is purely a playstyle thing. If you're planning on taking this build way further into higher levels, I'd recommend it with this setup. But if you're not planning on going that far, then Adaptation and Redirection are better choices. Because remember, shields naturally have damage reduction, and that stacks with Adaptation. Here are my Strunt Incarnate evolutions that I was using. And I went with a Viral Hunter's Munition setup because this thing absolutely ticks the hell out of enemies. And due to the slash, you could also go with Shotgun Elementalist instead of Galvanized Savvy. And of course, Fire Rate is personal preference as well. This is the weapon that's really going to allow you to do the massive amounts of damage spreading because it does a lot of damage per shot in both forms. And the damage spread is also really nice because of the AoE. But another good option you could also use is something like a Tigris. Anything with massive amounts of single target damage to help make use of those Tesla Nervos radial attacks. And my Furious and Bow Prime are the same builds from earlier. So there you have it, my version of revisiting Nyx and how I've been preparing for, of course, her proto version coming with 1999. I highly recommend you give these builds a shot, especially the Tesla one. Nyx has been a frame for a long time that I have ignored, mainly because I just never found her fun, but now I actually have somewhat of a reason to enjoy her every now and again, and I cannot wait to see what kind of rework she gets. It seems to be that Pablo is always in charge of reworking Warframes now, and he pretty much never misses, so I'm looking forward to that. And also, give me some ideas of who you want to see me cover next. I know that Trinity's probably on the chopping block as well, because she's getting a rework, so maybe I should revisit her. But I'm definitely looking to cover Valkyria soon as well. And also, thank you guys for the support on the videos. The channel is absolutely popping right now. We've definitely caught a little flow with the viewership, so make sure you're subscribed if you haven't. And if you also like what you see, make sure you go over to the Twitch channel and follow me over there if you ever want to watch me do these long survivals live and test builds and whatnot, theorize, chat, and just hang out. Appreciate you guys for all the support once again. You guys take care. Till next time.